The college football playoffs are less than a week away. The second of the two matchups on New Year's Day is going to be Texas versus Washington, two teams that are uniquely situated to expose the other team's weaknesses. Two teams with big name, possible first round picks at the quarterback position, and two of the three best receiving cores in the country. Will this matchup be sweet like sugar or sour like a brand new car that breaks after 2 weeks? Who knows? I certainly don't, but today I'm going to talk you through what I think is going to happen in this matchup. But before we do that, I would like to ask you to like the video, subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content, and drop a comment down in the comment section below. And now, with the intro out of the way, I'd like to say hello and welcome to the JSA studio. I am your host, as always, Nathan, and today we're going to be breaking down the Sugar Bowl, Texas versus Washington. We are going to start off today with a discussion about the two quarterbacks, Quinn Ewers for Texas and Michael Penix Jr. for Washington. We're going to go through each position group and decide who has the edge, Texas or Washington, before moving on to the matchups and the prediction at the end of the video. So, with Quinn Ewers versus Michael Penix, this is a close conversation in my opinion. However, I was able to come to a definitive conclusion. Let's start with Quinn Ewers for Texas. Where does Quinn excel? Well, I wouldn't particularly say that Quinn Ewers truly excels anywhere specifically because he's a very consistent quarterback at all three levels of the game and going either way, to his left or to his right. But if there was an area where he is closest to elite, it is in the intermediate over the middle of the field. Texas especially likes working that area with their tight end Sanders, and Ewers and him do appear to have a very, very good connection. Quinn Ewers is also very good at throwing the deep ball. I would not categorize him as elite. However, he is very, very good at it, especially to A.D. Mitchell, who he trusts, I feel like, implicitly. That A.D. Mitchell is a very, very good contested catch receiver and is a bigger body. And I feel like right now, at this stage of his development, he does better with those types of players rather than the smaller, quicker guy. Quinn is also very, very good off of play action, maybe one of the best in the country, and most important, probably, his offense is not holding back really at all. This isn't the Oregon offense, so to speak, where a lot of the production comes on quick passes underneath and screens where they put their best athletes into space and get them the ball quickly. Ewers has what I would categorize as a great but not elite arm, and he's a good enough athlete to potentially be able to scramble a little bit and pick up 5 to 6 yards, maybe a first down if everybody is absolutely bailed out of it. But this isn't someone who is going to be running around and making people miss in the backfield and extending plays. Where Ewers gets in trouble, weirdly enough, is when he's asked to throw the quick, short passes. He's consistently late on those passes, leading to balls that get knocked down or picked off. 3 of his 6 interceptions have come on balls thrown less than 10 yards down the field. I will also say this: Quinn Ewers is not particularly good at putting his receivers in advantageous situations, i.e. when he completes a pass, a lot of the times it's not a quote-unquote perfect throw where the receiver can easily catch it, tuck it, and then turn up the field and run for more yards. A lot of the times it's off to either shoulder or a little bit outside of each shoulder or down low or up high or something like that. He gets the ball to them and they catch it, but they don't necessarily have great opportunities to create yak after they have caught the ball. When it comes to Michael Penix, he's a little bit like the opposite of Quinn Ewers. He's an okay athlete like Quinn Ewers. People keep saying he's a statue, and I don't really understand it. He can move around a little bit. He hasn't needed to because their offensive line has been so good, but he has shown the ability, even this year, to be able to run around a little bit. However, Michael Penix is a little bit more inconsistent than Quinn Ewers. Quinn Ewers does not make the plays with his arm that Michael Penix makes with his arm. However, he also doesn't make the mistakes that Michael Penix makes with his arm. Michael Penix does kind of, at some times during games, looks down the field and says, Rome Odunze's a top 10 pick. Fuck it, I'm going to sling it. And that does pretty consistently get him in trouble. He's thrown 7 interceptions on balls that have traveled more than 20 yards down the field. Everywhere else, he's thrown 2. Now, a lot like Quinn Ewers, he's also very, very good over the middle in the intermediate area. However, he does struggle a little bit throwing to his right. He is a left-handed quarterback, so he does struggle sometimes to get enough arm on the ball to travel to that intermediate right. And what I mean by intermediate, in case that wasn't clear, is the distance between 10 yards from the line of scrimmage and 20 yards from the line of scrimmage. So if he's on the left hash, he sometimes struggles to be able to put enough mustard on the ball to get it to the right side numbers 15 yards down the field. In the short area, or the quick game, as I like to call it sometimes, he's, much like Quinn Ewers, kind of okay. Like, he's okay. He doesn't get in nearly as much trouble as Quinn Ewers does in the quick game. However, he's not great at it either. So overall, I think they're a close conversation, and this may or may not come down to your opinions on whether you would rather have the high end and the low end, or just kind of be in the middle a little bit. And what I mean by that is Quinn Ewers' worst game is going to be better than Michael Penix's worst game. However, Michael Penix's best game is going to be better than Quinn Ewers' best game. And this decision might shock some people, but I'm going with Quinn Ewers. I'm rolling with Quinn Ewers over Michael Penix. I think that Quinn Ewers' ability to read the field quickly and to not just chuck the ball around so much, and his ability to be able to take what the defense gives him as opposed to trying to make plays, is going to be perhaps the difference in this game. And I'm going to say that Quinn Ewers, because of that maturity, is going to be the quarterback that I would rather have, and the quarterback that I think is better. Moving on to the running backs, I'm going to preface this conversation by stating that if Jonathan Brooks was healthy, this would be a completely different conversation. However, he is not healthy, and he will not be coming back for the playoff game. So the conversation ultimately boils down to Dillon Johnson versus C.J. Baxter. And C.J. Baxter has been good. So let's go ahead and just start with him here. I think he's been good. I think he's a good receiver out of the backfield. He's an excellent check down option. He has the athleticism and the ability to slip through tackles that great running backs all have. He does have the size and speed to be able to handle the bulk of the carries in this offense. And he also has the vision and athleticism necessary to be able to perhaps bounce to a different hole if the first read isn't there, or to make somebody miss if an assignment is blown or something like that. Moving on to Washington and Dillon Johnson. I don't think a lot of people realize this, but Washington can run the football with the best of them. And Dylan Johnson might have been the best running back in the Pac-12 this year. Bro is 6 foot and 220 pounds. He can make people miss. He can run over people. He can juke you out of your shoes. He can run through you. However you want to put it, he can do it. He's a very good check down option. He's good in space. He's great between the tackles. He's great outside. If you want to run zone, he can do it. If you want to run some power or trap concepts, he can do it too. This is a tremendously good running back. When Washington has moved the ball consistently this year, it's mainly been Dylan Johnson. What I mean by that is not necessarily when they've scored points, but when they've been able to go out and put together 8 to 12 play drives, it's mainly been the running game with Dylan Johnson. Washington scores a lot of points on big explosive pass plays, but when they need to, they can also turn around and hand the ball off to their running back and grind out some long drives. This is not just an offense that has to score through passing the football 50 to 60 times a game. This is an offense that can change itself to adapt to the style of game that's being played. And Dylan Johnson is the major reason why they can do that. The drop off from him to their backup running backs is much higher than from CJ Baxter to their backup running backs, and about the same from Jonathan Brooks to CJ Baxter. So once again, I think we maybe have another shocker on our hands here, okay? But I think Dylan Johnson is better than CJ Baxter, and therefore I think the running back room for Washington is better than the running back room for Texas, because unlike a lot of teams, neither one of these teams really rotate their running backs. When Brooks has been healthy, it was him the vast majority of the time, and now that he isn't healthy, it's been CJ Baxter the vast majority of the time, and for the whole season for Washington, it's been Dylan Johnson. So this really did, I think, come down to who is better between these two players, and I think Dylan Johnson is better than CJ Baxter. So we're going to roll with Washington in this position group. This next group is why you came to this video. This is the marquee positions matchup, comparing Texas's skill positions, i.e. wide receivers and tight ends, to Washington's skill positions. So we're going to go sub position here by sub position. And what I mean is that we're going to talk about the X wide receiver, the Z, and the slot wide receiver, and then the tight end. And we're going to kind of talk this out and see who's better at what positions. And we're going to start with the most contentious, or at least what I am anticipating to be the most contentious discussion, which is the X receiver position, A.D. Mitchell versus Rome Odunze. Now, I really, really like A.D. Mitchell. I think he's a fantastic wide receiver. I think he's a late first or early second round pick. Rome Odunze is a top 10 lock as far as I am concerned. He is a much better, and clearly so, in my opinion, a better player than A.D. Mitchell. That's not to say that A.D. Mitchell is not a very good receiver, because he is one, and he will make plays in this game in all likelihood. But Rome Odunze is that dude, and A.D. Mitchell is not. Moving on to the Z position. Now that Jace McMillan is back for Washington, Polk moves to his more natural position as a Z rather than playing in the slot. He's still tremendously good in the slot, but he's, I think, much better as a Z rather than exclusively the slot option. So the conversation is going to be between Polk and Xavier Worthy. And I think this is closer than the conversation between Odunze and Mitchell. However, I do think there is a clear advantage in the favor of Texas and Xavier Worthy. Polk, again, is very, very, very good. However, Mitchell's better than him at being a Z, And also, if we were just talking about their snaps in the slot where they're doing slot receiver things, I also think Mitchell is better at doing that than Polk is. However, Polk, once again, I'm going to try to stress this as much as I can, is a very, very good receiver, okay? We're kind of splitting hairs between these receivers here, okay? But I just think that Xavier Worthy is better than him, and I have him graded much higher, at least early on in this draft process. So I'm going to go with Worthy here. So it's 1-1 so far. Moving on to the slot position. Now, for the majority of this year, like I said, it has been Polk. However, they've also played Bernard there as well, too. And for Texas, it's been Whittingham pretty much exclusively. However, now that Jalen McMillan is back, we're going to be comparing McMillan to Whittington. And this isn't even particularly much of a conversation, in my opinion. Jalen McMillan kind of blows him out of the water. If this was about Bernard versus Whittington, then I think this is a closer conversation, but I still probably would have went with Bernard. The final position that we're going to be comparing here is going to be tight end, and much like the slot position, this also isn't very much of a conversation. Jatavian Sanders is way better than anybody Washington has. However, I will say this. I'll give Washington this. Washington's tight ends are better at run blocking than Texas's tight ends. However, I don't think that's a vast margin. I think it's a definitive margin, but I don't think it's a huge, clear as day sort of thing. But I do think in the receiving game, it is for Texas. So I'm going to give Texas the edge at the tight end position, which of course brings us to 2-2, meaning we would have to get talking about depth and players that don't really play a whole lot. And I don't know how to have that conversation because these receiving cores, for the most part, have been healthy. So I'm pretty much just going to have to go with which group I think top to bottom in terms of the players that are actually going to play are better. And I think Texas's is. I think Texas has the number 2, 3, and 4 options if we were to rank both of these groups together, like for the best players in the group together. Rome Odunze is 1. I would have Worthy 2, Mitchell 3, and Sanders 4. So even though I'm really splitting hairs here, and ultimately this just comes down to an admittedly biased decision that I have to make here, because these receiving cores are both elite. They are either 2 or 3 in the country. You could put them in whatever order you want to, and I won't get mad. But I ultimately do have to make a decision, and I am going to go with Texas. Next on the docket is the offensive line. And here we're going to go position group by position group, starting with the tackles. So the discussion is mainly going to circle around the Washington tackle duo, Rosengarten and Fontenot, and the Texas tackle duo of Banks and Jones. But before we particularly dive into the specifics of these matchups and comparing the two tackle groups, I want to talk about how bullshit I think it is that Washington won the Joe Moore Award. Washington has the third best offensive line in the Pac-12. They had no business winning that award whatsoever. I understand that this is a tangent, but it annoyed me enough to the point where I felt like I had to say something about it. Otherwise, it was just going to annoy me even further. Anyway, I think Texas's tackle duo is significantly better than Washington's tackle duo. They're very good at pass blocking, the Washington tackle duo. However, I think the Texas tackling duo is just as good at pass blocking as the Washington duo, and they're night and day when it comes to run blocking. Washington's offensive line is not particularly great at run blocking, just kind of across the board, but they're fantastic in pass pro. But Texas's tackle duo is good at both. So at the tackle positions, I am going to give the edge to Texas. However, I will say this. The strength of the Washington offensive line is along the interior. Now, along the three interior positions, along the offensive line, guard, center, guard, so to speak, I think there is perhaps as close to a definitive advantage for Washington as there was a definitive advantage at the tackle positions for Texas. Brailsford, specifically, the center for Washington, has been absolutely outstanding. And if it wasn't for Powers Jackson at Oregon, easily would have been the best center in his conference. But at the guard positions, I do think that Washington does have the advantage. In fact, the Texas duo of Campbell and Connor really wasn't very impressive to me. Like, they were okay, much better at pass blocking than they were run blocking. But I felt like the Washington guard duo was more well rounded than they were. And overall, I would give Washington the advantage at the guard positions. And the center play is night and day between these two teams. Majors hasn't been bad for Texas, if I'm being just honest with you. He really seems like he's actually very good in the pass game, especially when there isn't a nose tackle on him and he can kind of just go and help one of the two guards or pick up a stunt or something. He's really, really genuinely very good at that. I believe he's a redshirt junior, so he is someone who I would like to see return to school and work on his run blocking technique a little bit, because he's got the size and the power necessary to be able to become a legitimate NFL prospect, but he's not quite there yet. Basically, what it boils down to is, when I'm comparing these two offensive lines, I think Texas has the best two tackles and Washington has the best guard, center, guard. And by a 3-2 advantage, I would say that Washington does have the better offensive line than Texas. However, I wouldn't put Texas or Washington in a top 10 offensive line list in college football this year. I don't think either of them were the best offensive lines in their conference. Even though they're good, they're not great, and I don't think they're anywhere near elite. And to reiterate, Washington had no business winning the Joe Moore Award. Moving on to the defensive lines. These are two different teams with different strengths along the defensive lines. For Washington, I think their strength is along the edges. I think Braylon Trice is the best defensive lineman of these two groups combined, regardless of the interior versus exterior sort of stuff that we're going to get into. But he is kind of like Batman with no Robin along the edge. And Texas might not have a Batman, so to say, along the edge, but they've got all four iterations of Robin in Sorrell, Bush, Burke, and Finkley. These are all guys that they can rotate in and out at any point, depending upon how they want to attack the offensive line, and there is no drop off in the quality or level of play and effort. Texas is deep at the edge rusher position. I don't think they have a first round guy like Trice is, in my opinion, but they have four guys that they can take in and out of the game at any point and not have any drop off in the quality of play. And that is extraordinarily rare at the college level, at least. So even though Trice is the best player along these two defensive lines, I would, because of the depth, still give the advantage along the edge rusher position to Texas. And moving along to the interior, it's not even fair to compare these two teams. Texas has two freaks of nature along the interior of this defensive line in Tavondre Sweat and Byron Murphy, both of which I think have a real legitimate chance to go in the first round of this year's NFL draft. I think Byron Murphy specifically is going to be someone that when the NFL gets a hand on his film, he's going to start skyrocketing up boards. This boy is fantastic. He might be the best interior pass rusher in the country. And his running mate, Tavondre Sweat, is probably the best nose tackle in the country. And he's dominant in the run game. He just doesn't go backwards like ever. And he does actually provide some serious pass rush upside as well. So along the exterior or the edge rusher position, Texas might not have a Batman, but along the interior, they've got two Batmans and an Alfred Collins, that is, who's also very, very good. I bet you didn't think that Batman analogy was going to have a payoff, did you? Well, it does. And it's been some of my finest work, if I do say so myself. Nevertheless, Texas is like 4 deep along the interior and 4 deep along the exterior. They've got 8, maybe 9 guys that they can rotate in and out and still be really, really, really good. And Washington doesn't have that. They've got some solid players, but this might be the best defensive line in the country with Texas. And Washington is not in that conversation. So this was a relatively simple decision for me. Texas has the advantage along the defensive line. As we shift now into the linebacker position, I want to issue an apology to Washington fans. Because if you watched my college football awards video, I gave the Dick Butkus Award, handed out annually to the best linebacker in college football, to Abdul Carter of Penn State. And I want to say right now, on the record, that I wish I would have watched some more Washington games other than the one Oregon game before I made that decision. Because Ulo Fushio, number 5 on your screen right now, whose name I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, is the best linebacker in college football right now. This dude is an absolute menace. He is a 6th-year senior, but he is still very, very good. And specifically as a blitzer and in pass coverage. He is a very rare breed of linebacker where I'm not sure if I want to blitz him on a pass down or drop him back in coverage on a pass down. Because usually linebackers are only good at one of those things. His running mate, Bruner, is a good example of that. Because he's someone who I don't particularly want to blitz. He's not that good at it. So I'm going to drop you back into coverage where he's genuinely elite, for a linebacker at least. And Ulo Fushio is very, very good at both. I would categorize him as elite in pass coverage and probably just as like a really good blitzer. So I suppose that I probably should just keep him back in coverage. But having 2 linebackers that you don't need to take off the field is an incredible advantage at the college level. It's an advantage at the NFL level. So to understand how impactful that is, even though Washington's defense has been average at best so far this year, without these pair of linebackers, this defense would be significantly worse. And Texas's linebacking core is not on the same planet as Washington's top 2 guys. This was maybe the easiest decision that I had to make. Honestly, if I'm being honest with you, Texas's second level of their defense is their weak point, especially in coverage. Ford, the linebacker on the screen right now, number 41, is your traditional sort of linebacker in the sense that he's kind of a liability in coverage and not really someone that you want to put in any sort of man-to-man situation against anybody, but he's very, very good at tackling running backs when they run the football. The main problem is that they don't have a coverage linebacker that they can rotate in there for obvious passing situations. So he does kind of get exploited a little bit at times. So because of that and several other reasons, all related to the quality of play, I'm going to give the edge to Washington along the linebacking core. The final position group, the defensive backs here, I'm going to kind of just get through this one. There's not a whole lot to talk about here. Neither one of these groups are all that good. And I do believe that Texas does have the slightly better group. Jabbar Muhammad, #1 for them, does stand out. For Washington, does stand out. He makes a lot of plays. However, he also gets beat a lot too. So he is the kind of guy that is going to be able to make plays. However, he's also going to give up plays as well. And the duo of Holmes and Muhammad for this secondary to go along with Watts and a few other players is enough to push Texas into the better than just competent range, which is where I would put Washington. And because of that, I am going to give Texas the edge for the defensive back groups. So, to recap these sort of positional rankings, which is ultimately just sort of an excuse to talk about the players on the roster here, I gave the advantage to Texas at the quarterback position, gave the advantage to Washington at the running back position, I gave the advantage to Texas at the skill positions, although it was tremendously close, and Washington is also elite in that area. I gave the advantage to Washington along the offensive line. I gave the advantage to Texas along the defensive line. And I gave the advantage to Washington in the linebacking core and the advantage to Texas in a somewhat close decision in the defensive back group, even though they are both somewhat mediocre. Moving on to what actually matters in terms of how the game is going to be played, we have the matchups, which basically means the quarterback versus the defense, the offensive line versus the front seven, and the skill positions versus the back seven. And this one is pretty simple. I said at the beginning of this video in the intro that these were two teams uniquely situated to be able to expose the weaknesses of the other team. And what I meant by that is that Texas's defense is a liability somewhat, or at least you can move the ball on them with relative ease, provided that you can pass block and keep that Texas defensive line from being able to disrupt the quarterback. Washington can absolutely do that. And Washington's defense is somewhat susceptible to teams that can drive the ball and move consistently, which is what Texas does really, really well. Now, don't get me wrong, Texas generates big plays too. However, they go on drives more often than they're getting the big play touchdowns. Okay, so let's go down through the list here. Washington, or UW as I put it on here because Washington was too big to fit every single time through this here. Okay, so the Washington quarterback versus the Texas defense as a whole. I'm going to give the advantage to Michael Penix and the Washington quarterbacks, okay? The Washington offensive line versus the Texas front seven, because I do think Washington is somewhat going to come out in this game and try to attack this Texas defense by airing it out quite a bit and not playing into Texas's strength, which is stopping the run, while also having an offensive line good enough to stop them from getting to the quarterback consistently. So I am going to give the advantage to the Washington offensive line versus the Texas front seven. And the Washington skill position groups versus the Texas back seven, not even a conversation. Advantage to Washington. So the Texas quarterback versus the Washington defense, pretty obviously, I think this goes in favor of Texas and Quinn Ewers. I don't particularly think that Washington is going to be able to get a lot of pressure. I think Braylon Trice is going to win a snap or two probably and be able to put some pressure on Quinn Ewers. I'm not sure Washington's defense as a whole is going to be able to slow down the run game at all, and that is what is more concerning than Texas getting a bunch of explosive plays, because Washington has actually had a pretty good defense against explosive plays this year, which was somewhat surprising to me. Where they've it's really been with long, consistent drives. I do think that the Texas offensive line does have the advantage against the Washington front seven, as well as Texas's skill position group versus the Washington back seven. Basically, I think both of these offenses are either borderline elite or straight up elite, and I think both of these defenses are mediocre at best, even though they do have the potential to be very disruptive. Shifting now into my prediction for this game, I just want to say before I actually give the prediction and why I went that way, I went back and forth on this a few times. In fact, literally while I was recording this, halfway through this video, I decided to flip my prediction. This is a very, very close matchup that could genuinely go either way. However, I am going to predict that Washington wins 34-31. Ultimately, I think I've seen more out of Washington in close games than I have in Texas, specifically with Quinn Ewers. Texas did manage to really genuinely, in all that the word escape applies to, they managed to escape with a win against Kansas State, Houston, and TCU. However, at least two of those, I'm not sure about TCU, but I'm pretty sure Houston and Kansas State both came down to the defense making a stop rather than the offense winning the game. And in all of Washington's close games, or at least most of them, Washington has had the offensive output to win the game when they had the opportunity. Big long drive to win the game against Oregon the first matchup. Big long drive to win the game against Oregon State. Big long drive to win the game against Oregon the second time. And to keep the ball away from Bo Nix. Just call it a gut feeling. I don't know, but I think when it comes down to it, Washington is going to win this game somehow. I think they're going to find a way to win this game. Somehow, some way, the offense is going to do just enough. The defense is going to make the one big play here or there. It might be a sack on third down. It might be an interception on an overthrow or a tip. I don't know. But I think and believe that Washington will find a way to win this game. But what do I know? I'm just some asshole on the internet giving you his opinion. It's at this point that I'd like to remind you to like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and if you disagreed with me, or if you just have something to say, go ahead and drop a comment down in the comment section below. And be sure to come back on Friday for the big one, so to say. And now that the outro is done and out of the way, there's only one thing left to say, and that's that I'll see you next time.